All right, good to be with you tonight. Thanks again for joining us, and so glad for this opportunity we have to study together as we go through the book of Proverbs. We are in Proverbs chapter 28, and tonight we begin with verse 21 in our study. The King James Version reads, "To have respect of persons is not good, for a piece of bread that man will transgress." Respect of persons. That's an expression that we find in the older translation. Literally, the word person there suggests the idea of the face. So it is to say having respect or showing partiality because of who somebody is, not what they are or what they've done. It suggests a miscarriage of justice. It suggests a prejudice, a partiality in particular. The idea of showing favoritism towards somebody that we know or somebody that has done us a favor or whatever it might be. So the picture is of someone who's in a position to make a judgment, a decision that's going to affect other people, but rather than reacting on the basis of merit, they react on the basis of one's face, one's person. To have respect of persons is not good, for a piece of bread that man will transgress. He'll go out of the way. He will apostatize. He will break away from what's right. You know, in the 18th chapter and the 24th chapter, several times in the book of Proverbs, we find warnings along this line. So it must be something that the Lord wants us to take special notice of, and I believe that is true. Matthew Henry wrote about this passage. He said it's a fundamental error in the administration of justice to consider the parties concerned more than the merits of the cause, so as to favor one because he's an old acquaintance or has formerly done me a kindness or may do me one, and to bear hard on the other party because he's a stranger or poor, or because maybe he did me dirty at some point, or has been my rival. There's several words I guess we use for someone of principle. We talk about people of integrity. I think it might be related to that word aritos that the Greeks use, that's so difficult to define. In our old King James Version, it's many times translated by the word virtue. Somebody who's virtuous is that rare individual who is a person of principle and who is a lover of truth. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. It has an obvious application to people who are in a position of judgment, whether that be a federal judge or a state judge or a local judge, or maybe someone associated with business whose job it is to make decisions about someone's guilt or innocence in a particular matter. But having the integrity and holding to that integrity is not common. And to go the other way is a slippery slope, and that's the point that he makes in our passage. That once a man puts his integrity up for sale, it immediately devalues, and pretty soon he can trade it off for very cheap. When a man has once accustomed himself, Wesley said years ago, to take bribes, a very small advantage will make him sell his justice. It reminds us of that passage in the book of Amos, where the Lord charged those of ancient Israel with, among other crimes, they sell honest people for money, and the needy are sold for the price of a pair of sandals. I ran across a book several years ago. It was actually a book from the early 70s, so it was an old book when I found it. But the book is called The Finest Judges Money Can Buy. It's written by a guy named Charles Ashman. And what it is he goes through the book, the records, the public records. It's about a 270-page book And he just goes over one crime after another perpetrated by judges. He gives examples, stories of corruption of judges. And then in the back he gives this index in which he talks about this judge having been found guilty of bribery, conspiracy to bribe fellow justices, fraudulent campaign funds, drunkenness, neglect of duty, income tax evasion, fraud, on and on it goes. If you're having too good a day and need to be brought down a little bit, this book will depress you, because it really is totally about stories, from the news. Again, this is a bit dated because it was written in the early 70s, but stories about judges in the good old USA. In the inside cover of the book, there's a little blurb here in which the author writes the following: "This book is dedicated to those judges who have resisted the temptations of corruption, avoided political influence, and consistently remained above moral compromise, in fact and in appearance. Congratulations to both of you." Wow. Well, and by the way, this is in the United States, which I think, all through the years has been a cut above a lot of places in the world. Hate to fall into the tender mercies of judges in some of the other places in the world, and yet we have such problems here. The point is that it's a tragedy, it's sinful, it's foolish, it's self-destructive. It's selling yourself out is a self-destructive act. But we make this point in passing, that it's not just those who sit on some bench somewhere. All of us in life are going to be challenged. Our integrity is going to be challenged. Are we going to be truthful? Are we going to be people of principle? Or are we going to compromise and give in? Every day, our integrity, our virtue is tested in that regard. The wise man said, once you compromise your word, once you compromise your principle, it's easier the second time and the third time. And as the Proverbs suggest, by the time it's all over, you'll sell somebody out for a piece of bread, or as Amos said years ago, for a pair of shoes. So what's the lesson? The lesson is determine to be people of integrity. Don't compromise yourself, and you'll be glad in the end. There's no way to stand up once you give in to those kinds of temptations. Let's think about another principle from the Proverbs. Verse 22 reads, "He that hasteneth to be rich hath an evil eye, and considereth not that poverty shall come upon him." He that hasteneth to be rich. That word hasten is an interesting word. It's a word, they tell me, which means literally to tremble. You get the idea of someone shaking physically. To palpitate. Of course, it's a figurative use of the word here. It's not someone literally doing that. But they are inside, just quivering, as it were. Agitated, hastening anxiously. I suppose in a more literal sense, you think about, I've never been a bird hunter, but I've seen bird dogs on the first day of hunting season, just shaking all over. I don't know how the dogs know. I guess they can read the signs around them that the season is here, the time is here, and they're about to be let loose for what they were made to do. And they love it, and they're just shaking all over with excitement. Well, here's a very different picture of a person who's also just quivering with anticipation, but what they are so excited about is getting more, getting more. They're covetous people. And the old expression here is one who has an evil eye. Several times in the scriptures we find that expression, both in the Old and the New Testament. The Lord used it at least one time. But I think that the reference that helps me to appreciate what's meant by that old expression is maybe an occasion where the opposite is found. If you turn over to the 22nd chapter of Proverbs, and we look back there, the passage we noticed earlier, Proverbs 22 and verse 9 reads, "He that hath a bountiful eye shall be blessed, for he giveth of his bread to the poor." So the evil eye is the opposite of the bountiful eye. Bountiful, generous, plentiful. Here's an individual who is a giving person. They have a generous eye. Well, the opposite of that is the evil eye. Stingy, self-absorbed, uncaring, resentful of others, totally selfish. That's what he means, I think, by this picture of the evil eye. Henry wrote, "They're always grieving at those that have more than they, always grudging their necessary expenses. They think the former keep them from seeming rich and the latter from being so. Between both, they must needs be perpetually uneasy." They're never happy people. They're resentful people. And they see about them things that they want and can't have and never appreciate what they've been given. That's the evil eye. They're people who look at life with an evil eye. Stingy, covetous spirit. One fellow wrote, he said, "A miserly man hastens after wealth, and he does not know that want will come upon him." The passage really promises the providence of God to bring a fellow down. A man who loves things and who makes things his God will ultimately find that false God will let him down. Brother Harkrider wrote, "His grasping greed becomes like a spider's web in which he suffers retaliation by those who defraud him and treat him as unscrupulously as he's treated others." You reap what you sow. And in so many cases we see that to be true. Bridges reminds us, "Insomuch as you love the earth, you lose heaven." Never had thought about it quite that way. But just as much as we love the earth, we lose heaven. And there are people in love with things and in love with this world, and they're not fitted for, they're not ready for, prepared for, nor will they be troubled by, if you want to use that word, life with God. Keep heaven, he encourages us, next to your heart as your treasure, your love, your rest, and your crown. That's the opposite of this man, just quivering with anticipation. Evil eye, given over to the love of things. Mr. Alden wrote, "Meanness of soul does not go away just because a man gets rich. He is just as miserable with it as he was without it, and eventually his poverty of soul becomes actual poverty when death robs him of all that he has." The ultimate fulfillment of this is found in death. Even if a man is able to hold on to things with a firm grip, eventually he's going to leave it all. And if that's his treasure, then he's the poorest man that's ever been, because now he faces God with nothing. So the picture here is a good one, a powerful one, even if it's a sad one. And that is that whether a man's got little or much, it's the spirit that we're talking about. Point's been made many times. It's not really riches or money that's the root of all evil. It's the love of it. Having a lot of money solves some problems. It creates other temptations. But the idea here is a man with the evil eye, a man who loves things, never finds satisfaction, and in the end, of course, like everybody, leaves it all behind. So, somebody says, what's the point? The point is the majority of the people in this world don't know that or don't live like they know it. And religious people can be caught up in the same rat race. Don't make the fatal mistake of thinking that somehow chasing after things brings worth or brings happiness. It does neither. nor does it bring security. Let's look at another example, if we might, from the Proverbs. Proverbs 28:23. He that rebukes a man afterward shall find more favor than he that flatters with his tongue. He that rebukes a man will find more favor afterward than the man that flatters. We have two people contrasted here. One is a rebuker and the other a flatterer. Rebuke is the idea of honest correction. That's the way one of the modern paraphrases renders it. And flattery literally goes back to the idea of smoothness. To be smooth, figuratively. By implication, as smooth stones were used for lots, an apportionment, or separate, deal, distribute, divide, flatter. A lot of different uses here. But I think the spirit of it is captured in the Bible in Basic English, which reads, one who says smooth words. And I might just add this note. I think the point is deceptively smooth. I don't think he's praising rough speech. But what he is condemning is deception in the guise of smoothness. So here are the two people that flank us. One is a rebuker and the other a flatterer. And the point made is that if we're wise, we're going to appreciate the man who tells us the truth more than the man who hides the truth from us. I like what the pulpit commentator said about this. He talked about a faithful counselor who tells a man his faults and brings them home to his conscience, checks him in his downward course, will be seen as a true friend and will be loved and respected both by the one whom he has warned and advised and by all who are well disposed. And then he quotes from James 5, if any do err from the truth, and one convert him, let him know that he which converteth the sinner from the error of his way shall save his soul from death and hide a multitude of sins. There is an advantage in helping someone to correct their path and correct their way. That's an important point. There are other Proverbs that speak similar lessons. In 27th chapter of Proverbs in verse 6, you can trust a friend who corrects you, but kisses from an enemy are nothing but lies. You can trust a friend who corrects you. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, as the old translation says. Flattering someone who ought to be rebuked is like encouraging a fool. On the other hand, when you encourage somebody down the wrong direction, you join with them in their evil, and you help them destroy themselves. You know, we find, I think, in the Scriptures some sad cases. One example is of King Asa. He was a man who failed to appreciate those who tried to correct him and tried to warn him and tried to bring him back to the path. Without maybe going into great detail about Asa's story, he was in many ways a good king. But Asa had a flaw and a failure, and he became too enamored with his own abilities and really lost to a certain measure his trust in God's ability to help and to direct and to preserve. And so on one occasion he gave away the treasury of Israel, or Judah in particular, to a heathen nation to help him out in a tight, rather than praying to God, a God who had helped him and brought him to the throne and done so much for him. And so one of the prophets, this is the story is over in 2 Chronicles 16, if you care to read along. One of the prophets, Hanani was the fellow's name, came to the king to rebuke him. At that time, Hanani the seer came to Asa the king of Judah and said, because thou hast relied on the king of Syria and not on the Lord thy God, therefore is the host of the king of Syria escaped out of thine hand. Excuse me. The Lord said, in effect, you to come to me, I would have given you not only help from your enemy, I'd have given you Syria too. but you failed to do that. You didn't trust me that much. Well, as a result, God sent this messenger to try to prick his conscience. He reminds him in verse 8 of the fact that the Ethiopians had been a great threat to him, and yet God had helped him in that battle with this enormous army. He tells that story earlier. So he says, why did you not rely on God now? How could you forget? Verse 9 is a great expression. The eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to show himself strong in behalf of them whose heart is perfect toward him. Herein thou hast done foolishly. Therefore, from henceforth, thou shalt have wars. Well, kings, many of them, I suppose, most of them, are not accustomed to having people come to them and talk so straightly with them. This prophet spoke in the name of the Lord, and his word should have been respected. But instead, Asa was angry, verse 10, and he put him in a prison house. He was in a rage with him because of this thing. And Asa oppressed some of the people at that time. And sadly, there's no indication he ever learned his lesson. He died in disease, searching one physician after another, never did pray to God about the matter. This lack of faith, this trust in himself, and this lack of trust in God seems to have been something that stuck with him until he died, sadly. So Asa's an example of a guy who was not wise enough to appreciate that kind of honesty. Let me give you a better case before we close this point. You remember the story from the New Testament. The Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul, those two men, as much as any mere human beings, I suppose, are associated with the church of our Lord. It's their work that we read so much about in the New Testament. And yet there were only a handful of occasions, it seems, when they were actually together. I believe they taught the same thing. There are those who try to separate the teaching of Paul and Peter as being opposed in some way. I think they both were preachers of the gospel, and I think their messages are complementary. But there was an occasion when they were together, and it was a very tense occasion. Stories told by Paul over in Galatians chapter 2. They were in Antioch, and to get to the point, there was a great deal of prejudice against Gentile Christians on the part of Jewish Christians in the first century. There was still a resentment there, or maybe we should say a feeling of separation. The Jews growing up had been taught that the Gentiles were of the dogs, they were not to be associated with. And even in the church early on, there was this feeling that somehow the Gentiles were second class. Well, the Gentiles obeyed the gospel up at Antioch, and many of the Christians from Jerusalem had been there with them and rejoicing with them and teaching them. But certain of that party of the proud had come up there, and Peter was more concerned about how these folks would see him than he was his Gentile brethren. He began to back away from these Gentile brethren, and some of the other brethren, watching Peter, Jewish Christians, they did likewise. And Paul was horrified by this. He got up there and saw what was going on, and he took Peter to task publicly. Peter, of course, was an apostle of the Lord. He was an elder, maybe by this time, I don't know. But he certainly was a man who should have known better. And so Paul took him to task directly. In Galatians chapter 2 and verse 11, Paul writes, "But when Peter was come to Antioch, I withstood him to the face, because he was to be blamed. For before that certain came from James, he did eat with the Gentiles. But when they were come, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing them which were of the circumcision. And other Jews dissembled likewise with him, insomuch as Barnabas also was carried away with their dissimulation, their hypocrisy. And when I saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth of the gospel, I said unto Peter before them all, If thou being a Jew livest after the manner of the Gentiles, and not as the Jews, why compellest thou the Gentiles to live as do the Jews? For we who are Jews by nature, and not sinners as the Gentiles, knowing that a man, he says, is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, even as we have believed in Jesus Christ, and that we might be justified by the faith of Christ and not by the works of the law. He said, Peter, you're just wrong about this. This is hypocritical, it's sinful, it's wrong. Well, that would be, I think, hard for many folks to take. Certainly Asa took a rebuke that was maybe milder than that and wound up putting the fellow in prison. You think Peter carried a grudge after Paul embarrassed him no little, called him out on his sinful behavior? Well, the indication that we have from Peter's own writing, the last letter that Peter wrote that we have is 2 Peter, we call it. And in 2 Peter chapter 3, and in verse 15, Peter is talking about the promise of the Word of God and the sureness of the prophecies of God, and how that there are some who have misunderstood the truth, but that's not the Lord's fault. And he writes anyway in the midst of this discussion in verse 15, Account that the long-suffering of our Lord is salvation, even as our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given unto him, hath written unto you. He goes on to call Paul's writing Scripture, acknowledging his place as one through whom God revealed the truth. And he called him our beloved brother Paul. Now that's a better fellow. Asa was resentful. He was touchy, arrogant. And those who tried to help him and enlighten him and correct him cast them into prison, cast the prophet into prison, punished other people. Peter was a man who could take a sharp rebuke. Peter knew that Paul was right. He knew that he had done the wrong thing, and he seems to have been grateful for that. At least it did not have or diminish in any way his love and appreciation for Paul and for his work. So, what's the point? The point is, be like the Apostle Peter, and don't be like Asa. A wise man is a man who understands and appreciates those who will come to him to correct him, and will know the difference between a flatterer and one who has his best interest at heart. Proverbs chapter 9 and verse 8, we looked at this earlier. It reads, Don't rebuke a mocker, or he will hate you. Rebuke a wise person, he'll love you. Counsel a wise man, he'll be wiser still. Teach a righteous man, and he'll add to his learning. So don't be fraudulent with other people, and don't resent people who are honest and true with you. Now let me add this little note here. When I say don't be fraudulent, don't be a flatterer, I don't think that's encouraging us to be tactless or to be impatient or to go around with a list and say, when I've observed you for the last 10 minutes, let me tell you 6 things wrong with you, and here they are. That generally doesn't get a lot of good done. But there's no room for dishonesty. And certainly those of us who are the recipients of correction ought to be grateful, thoughtful, considerate of it. You know, it may be true. Our reaction is just something about most people anyway. Maybe you're the exception, but most people, when they're criticized, they sort of bristle about that, or they think, well, now who are you to... But all that's nonsense. A wise person is glad to be taught. They just want to be right. And they don't let pride stand in the way or temper get a hold of them. And I think that's all wrapped up in what the wise man is telling us here. Be honorable in your dealing with other people, and appreciate that same treatment when it comes back to us. Okay, let's look at another, if we might. in verse 24, whoso robs his father or his mother, and saith it is no transgression, the same is a companion of a destroyer. A fellow that would rob his father or mother. It's a very violent word. If you begin to check the sources, you find definitions that include words like pluck off, flay, strip, rob, tear away, seize, plunder, tear off, take by force. So it's a very strong, aggressive word. And here that behavior is directed toward one's own parents. Bad enough with a stranger, but here toward one's own parents. And then on top of that, there's another layer of wickedness, and that is the fellow doesn't even have the conscience to recognize what he's done as evil, but says, oh, there's nothing to that. It's okay. That's mine anyway. I had it coming to me. That's what my parents are for. They're just here to serve me. Doesn't matter how I treat them. You know, that kind of a spirit. The wise man said that fellow's a companion of a destroyer. Companion partner. We might say he's in the same boat as a destroyer, a taker of life, a murderer. There's a passage in 1 John that I thought about in looking at this passage. And in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 14, there's a lot in this great little book about God's expectation of us to have a love in our heart and to let that guide what we do and how we live. Love is not indulging what everybody else wants or just telling everybody they're okay. That's not love. But there's no room in a loving heart for malice at all. And in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 14, John wrote, we know that we have passed from death unto life because we love the brethren. He that loveth not his brother abides in death. Whosoever hateth his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer hath eternal life abiding in him. That's similar, isn't it, to our text in Proverbs. Not literally that a fellow's committed murder, and yet in another sense, you know, he's in fellowship with murderers. A man who has malice and hatred in his heart. In this case, toward his brother. The Lord would say, even your enemies. That's not who my people are. And in our passage, we have someone showing that kind of depraved, hateful behavior toward one for whom God commands respect and reverence. Well, we can understand the depth of depravity involved here. It's not maybe exactly parallel, but it's reminiscent again of something the Lord said over in Matthew the 15th chapter. In this passage, the Lord is asked about why he violates, or his disciples violate, the tradition of the elders. Not Scripture, but just traditions that they had accepted, that they thought were good and reverent, and that they thought were maybe sort of a hedge around the law. And what they wound up doing was taking their own rules. That's really what they were, their rules. And you can just count on it. Whenever I start making my own rules, sooner or later, my rules are going to wind up undoing God's rules. And that's what the Lord said about it. He said, you are really good at making void the commandment of God. Let me read, if I might, just briefly over here in Matthew 15. They asked him, why do you not respect our traditions? He said, why do you transgress the commandment of God by your traditions? Verse 4. He gives an example. He says, for God commanded, saying, honor thy father and mother, and he that curseth father or mother, let him die the death. 10 Commandments goes back to the law of Moses. I'm sure it predated the law, really, but it certainly was included in the law. That's what he seems to be quoting there. And obviously the idea of honoring father and mother, as Jesus goes on to describe it, is more than just saying yes ma'am and no ma'am, yes sir and no sir. But it's the idea of showing respect, showing the deference, and as they may become older, showing then service toward them. The Lord said, honor father and mother. But, verse 5, but ye say, whosoever shall say to his father or his mother, it is a gift by whatsoever thou mayest be profited by me, and honor not his father and mother, he shall be free. A little difficult to follow that maybe, but the idea seems to be this, that they had a custom, a rule, a tradition, that a man could, while he was living, dedicate everything he had to God. Now, of course, he could use it. But once it was korban, dedicated to God, his possessions, that he could not give it to anybody else, even his parents, when they were in need. And if you ask him about doing it, he would say, well, I put God first. You're not putting God first by setting up a rule that's going to undo what God told you to do. But this is the twisted kind of thinking that the Lord was dealing with among the religious leaders. And he talks about this being pure hypocrisy. And he said, you're exactly who Isaiah was talking about. People draw nigh to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. You don't have a clue. Well, that's not exactly the same thing. He's not talking necessarily about violence in this case. It's all done very sweetly and legally, with high principle, seemingly. But really it's neglect, and it's depriving of parents, in this case, what they have a right to, and all of that. God hates it. He just hates it. So those who would cheat and defraud their parents, well, they don't measure very high on the Lord's scale. Another passage we think of is 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 4. The children and grandchildren of a widow must first learn to respect their own family by repaying their parents. This is pleasing in the sight of God. In other words, if you have someone in need, that job to fill that need, as far as the ability goes, falls on that family. And he goes on to make the point, if we fail to do that, if we neglect our obligation to our own, if anyone doesn't take care of his own relatives, especially his immediate family, he has denied the Christian faith and is worse than an unbeliever. I'm not sure about inserting the word Christian there. That's not in the text, I'm sure. But the idea is there. The faith. A fellow who would do that, why, he's on the level of a man who denies God. That's what the wise man said. He said a fellow who would do violence to his parents, he's in the category and the class in the same boat with a murderer. And so much of that goes on. I don't suppose that's news to many. I was looking at a story here in the past few weeks from the U.S. News and World Report health site. And it tells some sad stories. One lady who had an adult daughter living with her, and the daughter, rather than help her mother, wound up getting hold of her credit card, running up a $120,000 bill. She must have had a lot of credit. Spending it on all kinds of things, food delivery, purchased a new car in their mother's name, and all kind of trinkets and so on. Just left her in a mess. Well, you can say that's not violence, and yet in another way it certainly is abusive. There are some who are physically abused. You've and I maybe have heard stories, sad stories, about elderly parents who have to lock their bedroom doors, afraid of their own children who have taken over their house, as it were. They can't get rid of them, and afraid to live with them, afraid to go to sleep. They're just, whatever kind of evil you can imagine is going on somewhere. The Lord one day will put an end to that. But in the meantime, don't let anybody be fooled by this fact. God hates it. And he classes those who would be abusive toward their own parents with the very lowest of our society, the murderers and the scoundrels. To cheat, to neglect, to abuse brings the wrath of God. Mr. Clark wrote years ago, "He who robs his parents is worse than a common robber." To act dishonestly, whether it is to the act of dishonesty and rapine, he adds ingratitude. In other words, it's bad enough that he's violent or a robber or a thief, but he's also incredibly ungrateful to the one that God has taught us to honor. Parents bring up their children, then are abused by them and afraid of them. This is a tragic circumstance, and one that God will surely address. Okay, well, let's see. Our time is about up for this week. I think rather than rush through the next point, we'll certainly plan to finish up the 28th chapter next time. But let me make mention of this, if I might. I'll not be available next week, so we'll not plan to have a session next Tuesday night. But Lord willing, 2 weeks from tonight, we'll be back with our study of Proverbs. I do very much appreciate those who make time for this study. Think along with us. It means a lot. I appreciate your prayers in this regard. My only hope, my only ambition is that all of us, myself included, in thinking about these truths, might be made stronger. A fellow made a point that you have in the book of Proverbs so many thoughts. Very difficult to sit down and just read through the Proverbs. It's good to do that in one way, but it's almost like the Proverbs were written to be taken in small bites and digested and then come back for another. I heard recently about a fellow, and his practice was to read maybe a handful in the morning before he went to work. He might read until there was one that particularly struck him, and then he would write that down on a card and take it and look at it through the day. I thought that was a great suggestion. He'd even maybe try to commit it to memory. The point is, if we don't have it either somewhere with us or in our mind, hopefully, if we don't have that, they can't help us. We try to learn from these things and put them into practice. They are intended for a very practical use. And I hope you find this study to be helpful as we try to make use of this great inspired book. Anyway, thanks so much again for joining.